So many people have been emailing me daily saying, why have you not got Kevin and Annett on the channel? I've been on the road filming podcasts. I do apologize. I'm back in headquarters now, and this has been the absolute priority to get Kevin on. Oddly enough, when I was interviewing David yesterday on the Isle of Wight, he did raise this subject, and I've got a clip coming out with him on this subject as well. And he also raised Kevin and praised Kevin to the high heavens for his work, exposing not just the atrocity that we're going to discuss today, but if you go back and look at Kevin's playlist, I'll put it in the description box below the video, I'll go over to his links as well, you'll see he's been exposing atrocities committed by church and state across the world. Got all kinds of esoteric little videos, such as the papal assassination squads and all kinds of esoteric sounding organizations. It's endlessly fascinating. It's like a labyrinth of information that you would really have to find someone who's done deep research to get this information out there. And Kevin certainly has done that. He's been banned from various platforms, but we've got him on here today. And this is not a conspiracy. You know, whenever we have controversial guests on, people say, this person's making this up. Why have you got him on? 215 bodies were found. This is not a conspiracy. All the main news entities in the UK are reporting this story. Kevin has been talking about this for years. The mainstream media is only just playing catch up. Anyway, without any further ado, here is Kevin. He's one of the most articulate speakers we've ever had on the channel, and you're going to see how well researched he is on this stuff. 215 bodies were found. The the PM of Canada is asking the Pope to apologize, and no apology has been forthcoming. So we're going to go over all that. All right, Kevin, do you want to just say a little bit about yourself to reintroduce yourself to people who are not familiar with your work?
Well, I've been at this 25 years. I was a Protestant clergyman on the west coast of Canada when I discovered mass graves in Port Alberni from eyewitnesses who dug them. That was the fall of 1994, and I lost my job over that. I lost my family, blacklisted, but a whole new life opened up. I discovered my purpose, which was to bring out this truth and also expose this false religion, especially in Rome, which has been the cause historically of so much of this genocide. And for Prime Minister Trudeau to ask for an apology from the Pope, an apology is a legal formula whereby people indemnify themselves. It has nothing to do with sorrow or changing the problem. As a matter of fact, this present Pope constantly reaffirms the standing Vatican policy that when children are harmed, the police are not to be told. It's an institutionalized cover-up. So we got to put that in context. Also, this location where they found the 215 children, as we all know from our own statistics, it's a drop in the bucket. There was tens of thousands of children who never came back, over half the children. And the government of Canada's official position is still the death rate was under 1%, even though their own documents show 50%. I mean, we surfaced these documents from Dr. Peter Bryce. It's in murderbydecree.com. All of the evidence that the children were deliberately being exposed to TB and smallpox, killed with germ warfare. The record's continually suppressed. It's been published ever since when you look at when the stuff first came out in Canada, the Ottawa Citizen had it on the front page of November 15th, 1907. So that's 114 years ago, the extent of this has happened, was well known. So all of this is a continual, like an Orwellian rewriting of history every 5 minutes. And they're relying on people's ignorance and denial and horror at these things. But what's significant, and I just want to remind folks that this last week, we reissued the list that we had sent out originally in 2008, 28 mass grave sites across Canada. And as well in our list is 6 other sites that are present body dumping grounds for Native people that are killed. Because don't forget, the media and the government and the churches who did the crime are now framing it as a horrible thing that happened in the past. Well, the reality is, that it's ongoing. This genocide is continual, and these mass graves include many Native families being killed and driven off their land by Chinese corporations, PetroChina, in collusion with the Canadian government. Prime Minister Trudeau has allowed them to station their troops on Canadian soil. So I mean, this is all part of this bigger agenda of the Chinese government doesn't want, the extent of this genocide shown, because it'll shine a light on how it's still happening today. So, the whole cover-up happening now is going to be seen in that context.
Who initiated the search for these corpses?
It was what's called the Kamloops Band Council. Now, in the native world, there's the traditional people, and then there's the band councils who are appointed basically by the federal government. They're agents of the crown. They're not allowed to talk about this stuff. As a matter of fact, there was a secret deal struck. One of my friends, Bruce Gunn, was in on the meeting, so he told me about it. Back in 1996, the United Church, who was the first church being sued over the residential school massacre, they sat down with the West Coast Council of Native Chiefs and said, we will give you settlement money, personal injury settlement money, provided you do two things. Have nothing to do with Kevin Annett and his investigation, and never mention dead children and mass graves at these schools. The chiefs went for it, and ever since that period until right today, they've not mentioned. As a matter of fact, they've been our chief adversary in stopping the unearthing of these graves, like the dig we conducted at the Anglican school in Brantford, the Mohawk school, where we actually uncovered bones, which were verified to be children. The Canadian media totally blacked that out in 2011. Today, suddenly it's a legitimate topic, and the reason it is the Kamloops Band Council, for generations, were the ones that tracked down the children when they ran away. They would help bury the children. There was a special deal with the chiefs going back almost a century. If you bring in all the children into these death camps, your own children don't have to be brought in. So they were on they were on the payroll and colluding up to their eyebrows for a long time. So naturally, they want to conceal that by looking like the good guys now. But one of the reasons we think that the Kamloops Band Council initiated it was that don't forget, the Kamloops School is where Queen Elizabeth abducted those 10 children in October 1964, and they were never seen again, just 30 kilometers away from the school at a place called Dead Man's Creek. Well, William Coombs, the eyewitness, saw she and Prince Philip do that. The whole testimony of William was on the verge of being released again. We had relaunched the tribunal in Canada, the Canadian Genocide Tribunal. And right on the verge of that happening, suddenly there's all this government media spin and church spin about the Kamloops School and how they're trying, they've created the impression that they're trying to get at the heart of what really happened. Well, that was to undo very much what we're doing again, because we were beginning to get real traction around the world in the media. Now, the very fact that the BBC and New York Times and groups that normally ignore what we're doing, the very fact that they're repeating now the government's line on this and reporting this, even the Pope's responding, obviously that's a huge contrivance. Really, it's the last stage of the cover-up. They got rid of the documents, they silenced the witnesses. Now that what they've got to get rid of is any lingering forensic evidence. Because don't forget, the RCMP and the churches have been destroying these graves systematically for many years. And they've got to make it seem like, that they're not shirking their responsibility, before international law to investigate genocide. Because 2 years ago, Prime Minister Trudeau admitted publicly genocide had occurred. This is his way of saying, look, we're fulfilling all our obligations under the law, we're digging, when in fact they're not really. It's like their previous bogus inquiries. It'll conceal more than it reveals, really. We've learned that already.
So the mainstream media in the UK is reporting that there could be various reasons for the deaths of these kids, including disease, TB, malnourishment. They do have abuse on that list. What do you make of them peppering those various reasons out there?
It's the usual psychological technique of, well, yeah, some bad things happened, but we didn't really set out to wipe them all out. So they've got to, like you say, pepper it with all sorts of other, it's what lawyers call creating a paper trail. You fog the genuine evidence with all this other stuff. One thing they tried early on in this whole cover-up was they would really emphasize how children were denied contact with their parents. and beaten sometimes. Well, people say, well, that happened to me as a kid. What's the big deal? What are the natives complaining about, right? The reality that they're completely smothering again is that the Kamloops school was a special treatment center. And we have this from correspondence from eyewitnesses. Children who ran away a lot and who resisted and who held on to their identity and their language were shipped off to Kamloops. And what happened there was it was an early recipient of military money for mind control experiments, sterilization programs. William Coombs, Jesse Jules, other witnesses have described, and it's in murderbydecree.com, they've described being taken when they tried running away and put among children who were dying of tuberculosis. They described subterranean chambers where children were taken and experimented on. And they pointed out that site, and they said, if you look on the grounds of the school now, the recent building that the band council constructed is right over that subterranean chamber. So as the puppet chiefs often do, they actually build stuff over the genuine graves, and then they dig up stuff where children might have died from other causes and say, yeah, let's see how they died. But 90% of it, it's like an iceberg. You don't see it, what would really happen, because don't forget, the proof of that has been systematically destroyed. That in the government even admitted during their bogus Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where people weren't even allowed to name the names of perpetrators, they admitted during that yes, half the children probably died. And there were government document destruction teams going around as early as 1960 and systematically wiping out any evidence of children dying. So, it's a miracle if you find out any of the truth of what happened. Fortunately, we published this in murderbydecree.com. You can see indications of these much wider genocidal crimes, which once again is being edited out of the official media accounts, right?
When you said mind control experiments, could you define what you mean by that? Perhaps expand on the nature of the experiments that you feel were underway there?
There was pain threshold experiments. And for example, in at least half a dozen other hospitals, Indian hospitals across Canada in the West, they would do things like see the limits of mental and physical endurance to pain. So they would take children, put chemical warfare agents on their skin, rip out parts of their body to see, it was military backed, to see how much pain a human body can take and have the brain still function to apply to soldiers in combat. They're using children to do that. We've had survivors of the Lincoln Park Air Force Base in Calgary describe to me, the sole survivor of those experiments, describing to me, Gail Perkins, her name is, she lives in Salt Spring Island, British Columbia. And she said the doctor working on her had an SS tattoo right there. His cover name in the Royal Canadian Air Force is Major Bob Armstrong. We've discovered his name is Heinz Lehmann. He was an SS doctor who worked in Auschwitz. Most of the paperclip Nazi doctors were brought into Canada first after World War II, and then brought into the US through false identities and passports. Canada's always served as kind of the back door for all of this stuff. But a big chunk of those Nazi scientists, they didn't simply go to work with NASA and the space program. They were at work in Indian hospitals right across Canada. Joseph Mengele, documented to have worked out of the Allen Memorial Institute of Montreal. The list goes on, and that's why the list we published of the residential school mass graves, we included some of these body dumping grounds, because it's in a place like Kamloops. They were constantly doing these experiments. Kids were saying, as a matter of fact, we have a letter from Kamloops principal, and I'll dig up the name in a minute. He said, there's so many children dying, we've had to bury them 2 and 3 to a grave. Right. And, this is the official correspondence going on. And yet now it's like, oh, we've suddenly discovered. It's kind of like Al Capone in Chicago saying, gee, I didn't know people were being thrown in the lake. Let's do an official inquiry into my own crimes. The fact that the Catholic Church is allowed to do this is allowed to still operate, along with the Anglican United Churches. They wipe out tens of thousands of children. They get away with it. And then they have the gall to define the narrative and say, we're going to do right by our, these poor children that somehow got harmed by somebody else. It's like a crime without criminals. And that's the consistent, spin that they put on this, right?
So I imagine experiments of that nature are expensive, and they have to somehow justify it to the, whoever's in charge of the budget at the time. Is it a base on the basis of, it's going to be a military advantage? We have to do this. It's in the interest of national security. Is that the kind of philosophy that they use to justify these horrendous acts?
Well, don't forget they don't have to justify them. Who are they answerable to, right? But when this stuff comes out and they have to create a public spin on it, they say, yeah, it happened during the Cold War. There was tremendous amounts of U.S. military money for these, mind control experiments, but other things too, like big pharma. And here's the link to today and the whole COVID thing.
Oh yeah, we can't discuss that, Kevin. Unfortunately.
Oh well, okay.
We just got to stick on the present story, the kids.
Okay, well let me.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
then let me say that related. This has been documented that various pharmaceutical companies were continually using native children in drug testing protocols for all sorts of experiments and testing out new serums. That was standard practice. Some of them, we found that some of these companies were donating to the seminaries where priests and clergymen are trained. And there was a long-standing agreement. They fund the churches provide batches of children for these drug testings. That was going on in a big way. There was a separate, at Kamloops, there was a separate infirmary where the children were taken. Doug Abbott, he was a survivor of the school. He said, I was called one of the red tag boys. If you had high marks or you spoke your language, you got a red tag and they put you under the x-ray machine for 10 minutes and they sterilized you. That was happening in Kamloops. Just like out of Auschwitz, the sterilization programs. They would try out experimental IUDs in young girls, insert them, like at the Lakehead Thunder Bay Hospital, where a lot of Nazi doctors worked out of. Same thing in the Kamloops Infirmary. So these are obviously things that they're not going to report because the things they report can be classified legally as a tort offense, as a civil action where you apologize and give money, not criminal law. Criminal law is when there's mass murder and genocide and people have to go to jail, starting with the Pope and the Prime Minister, and because they're the responsible officers. So don't forget, these bodies have already been convicted in our common law court trial in Europe in 2012, 2013. So what they're doing is utterly illegal. For a convicted criminal body to be digging up their own crime scene, it's forbidden specifically for the perpetrator of a crime to investigate it or to frame a narrative about it. But that's exactly what's going on again. So Canada gets away with it again, right?
So one of the things I found disturbing was they said when the kids came in, they weren't allowed to speak their own language or engage in the cultural practices. And the justification was that it was to help them assimilate into Canadian society. So what would it be like for a kid arriving at somewhere like Kamloops?
We've had direct descriptions of that from people like Harriet Nahenny, Doug Wilson, others who in our films and on murderbydecree.com describe the first day. Whole villages cleaned out. Under the law, a child 7 years and older had to go to one of these or their parents would go to jail. In fact, they cleaned out whole villages. So, I mean, imagine a village devoid of children, just gone. Even the babies carted off to these places. That often just kill the babies. Lethal injection, incineration, that kind of thing. I've had Irene Favel, we have her online, a 78-year-old woman describing seeing newborns thrown into the furnace by Catholic priests, the Muskegon school in Saskatchewan. So, I mean, yeah, those who survived would be brought in, they'd be lined up, their heads immediately shaved, given a number. And the people who did that to them were other Native kids, like in Auschwitz, the Sonderkommando, right? They would be beaten. The kids who agreed to rat out their fellow students that have clubs and that start whacking the other Native kids if they spoke their own language, because language is identity and it's your power. It also identifies in an oral culture, like on the west coast of Canada or anywhere in the Native world. An oral culture defines the territories. When one dialect changes, that means the territory ends. So if you want to take somebody's land and confuse the memory of who owns what, you've got to wipe out the language. It was all about money and land, don't forget. These churches, the Catholic Church is one of the biggest landowners in the world because of these practices that go back many centuries, right? So it all had a reason to it. It was all about money, just like it is now. So the thing about banning language, it was key to the mental control and the long-term genocide that was being the plan from the beginning and carries on today.
Did MK Ultra have a branch in Canada?
Oh yeah, very much. Canada was one of the chief recipients of MK Ultra money. Like you can look up. This is one of the stories they've allowed out. Dr. Ewan Cameron at the Allen Memorial Institute. One of my friends, Ann Diamond, is a survivor of his experiments, and he had a method where he could wipe out memory and then reconstruct it. It was like to create a new personality, the perfect worker and or soldier who wouldn't question. In fact, they developed a drug as part of the MK Ultra experiments, which were going on in Kamloops. They developed a drug called chlorpromazine, which is known as the chemical lobotomizer because Ruth Kyander, who was another one of these Nazi scientists, described it as allows the suspension of critical judgment without loss of consciousness. So you've got the perfect slave. People can function, but they can't think critically. They can't question. And it also had a side effect of sterilizing people. So it's the perfect answer of the elite: control world population or depopulate, and then have a population that can't question. When you look at people walking around today or at any point, and the extent to which they just automatically obey authority, I mean, I think, there's more than meets the eye on this in terms of developing these drugs and methods that are really about mass mind control and conformity. So the natives are the perfect guinea pig for that. They're always tried out first. We're seeing now some of the evidence of that, but it's this wider story has got to be told, because then people will realize, you got to turn the tables on these churches and governments, put them on trial, stop them from doing these investigations that are really just destroying a crime scene. It's really an obstruction of justice what they're doing right now. And one of the announcements that came out is we're forming our own forensic teams with the help of people in Europe and America. And we're going to be going to some of these other remaining sites, doing our own analysis, releasing the full results of what those forensic tests show, cause of death, who did it, that whole thing, right?
So we see a bit of passing the buck here with the church blaming the government and the government blaming the church. Who created the idea of these schools? Who funded the schools and who ran the schools?
The original idea is very old. It comes out of Rome, right? And it was the Jesuit model, and the present Pope is a Jesuit, of course, the only one in history. The Jesuit plan was you go into an area, you take the children of leaders, you brainwash them, and then through them, you run the country. And that was the model of the first residential school in Canada, created by a Jesuit bishop called Paul Duryea. And that model, it was called a watchman system, where the Catholic Indians on the reserve would watch everybody else. And if anyone was speaking their language or practicing their traditional beliefs, wham, they'd be killed. Many of the chiefs today on Indian reservations are descended from those Catholic chiefs who literally took the indigenous chiefs out in the woods and killed them or drove them into exile. And they're the band councils like the one in Kamloops now are the descendants of those agents of the Vatican. So it originally came from Rome, but in Canada, it was a tag team operation from the beginning. They were running mission schools, but in around 1890, 91, the Crown stepped in, legalized it, gave the legal sanction to these schools so that the schools were run by the churches and funded about 50-50 by both church and state. That's thoroughly documented in murderbydecree.com. As a matter of fact, early on in my research, like 20 years ago now, I found a document which sealed the fate of the churches in the first lawsuits. It was called the Application for Admission Form. Every native parent had to sign it or they'd go to jail. It surrendered guardianship rights to the principal of the school, who was invariably a clergyman, and it was countersigned by the Indian agent. So it was church and state wiping out any control the parents had over their children. And so that's why church and state were both sued in the lawsuits. And they've always been, I mean, they're really one organism in Canada. There's no pretense of a separation of church and state in Canada at all. In fact, even I'm not sure in the law in England, but there's my ancestor, Peter Annett, he was a free thinker philosopher in London, and they put him in the stocks because he criticized the doctrine of Orthodox Christianity about the Bible or about the Trinity and the miracle stories. And he was charged under a law that's still in place. It's called blasphemous libel. If you criticize, in Canada, if you criticize the doctrines of the Christian church, you can go to jail for 2 years. because it's seen as an act of treason. If you attack the church, you're attacking the state. And that's, that King George during the American Revolution said, no bishop, no king. That was his slogan. If you get rid of the bishops like the American revolutionists were doing, or like Cromwell had done earlier in England, you get rid of the king, because it's coming from the same notion of one person rule, either, a religious monarch or a secular one. It's the same idea. So really, there's no division in practice between church and state when it comes to these crimes of genocide, whether in Canada or anywhere, really,
Okay, well, taking Kamloops as an example, then I'm just trying to figure out the hierarchy of who would be involved in that location. So you said the kids go in, the lackeys shave their hair, and do this and that, and then would they be answering to priests, nuns,
Yes.
government
staff are all church.
employees?
Yeah, the staff are all church people, priests and nuns. In the Anglican and United churches, they'd be church hired staff. The principal had absolute hiring, firing ability, but he was answerable in theory to the Minister of Indian Affairs and to the local Indian agents, right? But survivors as children rarely saw Indian agents. They were supposed to have monthly inspections. People have told me they didn't see Indian agents for years. The church was given carte blanche to do anything. And I know when I was thrown out of the United Church for surfacing this stuff, I wrote to the Attorney General of British Columbia, and I said, hey, they're putting me through this kangaroo court. I'm not allowed to see evidence. This is going against, due process. And he wrote back, Ojel Desange, the Attorney General, in 1998. He writes back and says, the processes, internal disciplinary processes of the church are outside the jurisdiction of my department. In other words, they're outside the law of Canada. So like with the Catholic Church, but with all these churches, they're not answerable to the law. They have their own law. They can do what they want to their employees, like me. They can do whatever they want to children in their custody. They were the legal guardians. They could kill them. Like today, you can kill a native and there's no legal consequence because they're not citizens. They're wards of the state. They're like children under the law. You can do whatever you want to them. So I mean, it's not surprising that with that whole system in place, you're going to get not only the mass murder, but the present cover-up. Nobody's ever gone to jail for the murder of one of these 60,000 children, yet they're claiming to be doing another investigation into it. I mean, it's tragedy become farce. I don't even know, after a while, like I was just talking to a friend of mine yesterday, and he survived these experiments. He was a Haida man who was put in the United Church Charles Council Hospital in Edmonton, and they were sterilizing them and doing all sorts of stuff. But he said, all I can do, the only way I survive this now is seeing this crap they're pulling now, just got to laugh at it. You got to realize that there's a higher justice and we can't give up this fight, but we got to know that these people will answer to this higher justice. And, I believe that, but it doesn't lessen our need to continue pushing on this and exposing that these things are being covered up now to allow it to continue. There's Native families being wiped out as we speak in northern British Columbia by the Chinese cartels, by, forcing them off their land to get the liquid natural gas. They can cover up the crimes of the past. They can do it all easier now.
So were schools like Kamloops magnets for pedophiles?
Well, yeah, because first of all, the Catholic Church since 1929 has had the policy in Crimen Solicitatis that says, if you rape a child, you're to be quiet about it. The police will not be told. So if you're a child rapist, you can get ordained as a priest and rape whoever you want, and you'll be officially protected by a papal doctrine that goes back to 1929. Every pope stands by it. Perfect breeding ground for child rapists. But beyond that, there's a law in Canada that protects, like I just mentioned, you cannot, Section 176 of the Criminal Code of Canada says you cannot disturb a clergyman in the course of his duties. It's a criminal offense. So, they're carting kids off to be raped. A cop stops and, no, I'm taking these children to mass. Oh, okay, father, do whatever you like, and then they're dead. I mean, these built-in institutional safeguards are designed to allow genocide and protect it and conceal it after, right? It's set up that way, right?
So people are shocked by the discovery of the 215 bodies, but the impression I'm getting from you is that this was not unique. What was the scale of this then? How many other Kamloops were there out there?
At the peak, right after World War II, there was 141 of these places, most of them in the West, because the West is where the lingering indigenous people were. The term assimilation, it actually means to eat somebody, and that's the code word that they used for genocide. Now it's healing and reconciliation. You hear that word a lot, as if you can somehow reconcile with a little corpse in the ground. But the language is very important. It's designed to normalize and to soften the impact of what we're talking about. I mean, if people really knew what put those children in the ground, they wouldn't be able to sleep at night. And they certainly wouldn't be, if they were moral individuals, they wouldn't be able to put money in the collection plate. One of the things that has to happen immediately is the charitable tax exempt status of these churches has to be immediately revoked, because if not, Canadian taxpayers are breaking international law by funding a proven criminal organization like the Vatican that launders money from the mob, that deals in arms, that deals in children, that's committed genocide for centuries. So we have to stop paying these taxes to these genocidal bodies, tithings. It's just international law and morality, right?
So you said there's a vast number of these schools then, and I think you said you estimated that 60,000 kids in total were disappeared. What do you base the 60,000 number on?
The government's official statistics are 150,000 children died. We found as early as the first year, and here's one table, you can't see it very well, but it's from the first, you see these words, died, 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 died. This is the Catholic school in Regina, Saskatchewan. The year of its first opening, 1896, 8 of the 12 children were dead, 2/3. Okay, that's before the TB even starts building, right? 2/3 dead. Now that's a genocidal death rate level. Peter Bryce, who actually the mainstream press have quoted, he in 1907, he was an Ontario health officer. He visited all the schools in the West. He said in every one, they were taking children who were healthy, locking them in with the ones who were sick, and then never treating them. He said, he wrote a book about it called A National Crime, which we've reprinted in murderbydecree.com. He said 50 to 70% of the children dying was not uncommon. And like I said, the front page of the Ottawa Citizen gives a death rate of 69% at the Muskegon School in Saskatchewan. So, it's, if you take that official figure, over half, it's half of 150,000 to 75,000 children. So even though by their own statistics, he's even greater than 60,000. But we know, I mentioned earlier how they would grab kids from a whole village. They didn't differentiate by age. So their estimate of 150,000 children is very low. It was probably double that. It's in the hundreds of thousands. Well, on average, half the children died. 50, 60,000 is conservative. It's 100,000 plus. And to show you how that isn't unrealistic, 50,000 dead children a year means you just had to have had one child die every week in the school. Now we know in 1 week period, there was, for example, we've got statistics of in the Kamloops infirmary, 6 children dead in a week. They don't give cause of death, of course. They all go into the infirmary and die. The death rate on the Indian reservations was around 5% when these places opened. In the schools, it was 50%. So 10 times the chance of dying if you go into an Indian school. And that was the same whether it's 1900, 1950. Neil Parker, the superintendent of Indian Affairs in 1949, said half the children are not surviving to take advantage of the education we give them. That's the top official in Canada for Indian Affairs saying half are dying. Yet now the government tries to pawn off this, 1-2%, 3,000 children over the entire century. It's Holocaust denial on an enormous scale, but everybody repeats it because they're the government,
What were the kids' lives like before they were rounded up to be brought to these schools, and what methods did they use to round them up?
Oh, well, you mean what was it like on the reservation?
Yeah.
Pretty deplorable conditions, but still they had some freedom to hunt, to have, certain limited, but, rights. But once you're in the schools, it's a prison. You can never leave, except in a casket. They had the Anglican Church. We found documents showing how they hired professional bounty hunters to go out and hunt down children. There was the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and clergy who would go out to the villages and clean them out. Harriet Nahanni describes how in her village of Klaus, it's on the west coast of Vancouver Island, the population went from 2,400 to 44 in 2 generations. That's about a 95% death rate from the smallpox and TB, right? Deliberately introduced. But when they rounded up the kids, it would be the cops, always the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the clergy who would do it. And it was the chiefs who would track them down. Their own chiefs would then go hunt the kids, as the Mounties were. Harriet said she ran away. The Mounties would bring her back tied in a rope, running behind a car, and then they put them in the stocks. They had the Anglican church in Lytton, St. George's School, had these stocks where they would put children in, like out of the Middle Ages, right? Leave them in there for days. I talked to the guy who buried one of these kids. I mean, Sean, the evidence is enormous, and yet it's gleaned out all the time, just sifted out. And the censorship with the internet now is so achievable that you talk to people now and mention my name and the work we did, and nobody knows. Nobody remembers, even though it was just 10 years ago. After the spin and the apology in 2008, my name was removed from the Canadian media. You never saw it again. Kevin Annett, it was like being a banned person in apartheid South Africa. Your name wasn't allowed to be mentioned. My name hasn't been mentioned. I'm always referred to as a controversial minister on the West Coast. And that word controversial gets Canadians scared, right? Names being banned, evidence being censored all the time. It's the norm. So it's so essential now for the truth of this to come out, because they're doing it again. They're like I say, they're bearing the final piece of evidence, the forensic hard evidence that the bones are in the ground.
So I'm curious about the sleeping conditions then in the schools. Were they like sardined into dormitories, or what? How was it structured?
Well, they always had the boys and the girls separate. They never let the boys and girls mix. Like Harriet said, she never saw her little brother. She was there for 3 years until he died. Never saw him once. So that, if you look at the Genocide Convention, that's one of the points in their definition of genocide. If you destroy normal family relations, right, and take children from one area, put them in another, and they would not only do that, separate the boys and girls, they each gave them a different name. So if you look in the records, 5 siblings in one family will each have a different last name. So A, you can't trace the dead, and B, the children don't even know who they are anymore. And they would give them derogatory names, like last names like Jumbo, Fatty, Fatty, like designed to degrade. And when you work in the healing circles with survivors, like I've done for over 20 years, and even before that as a minister, the death rate from suicide is enormous, because people have zero self-esteem, and they're actually programmed, when people start talking about these things, to actually kill themselves. And I've seen that happen a lot, right? So talk about a David and Goliath battle. This is kind of, I mean, if there was such a thing as an honest movie making industry, it would make an amazing feature film, this whole story of how this came out, right? And what still goes on.
Yeah, I mean, you've described death and destruction on an industrial scale at the hands of priests and nuns. Is this a crowd psychology thing? Do they, how do they justify this, the priests and the nuns do it at this level?
They never tried to. I mean, I've spoken to people who used to work in these places, and it's the way that people rationalize. They compartmentalize. They say, well, all I did was pick up the kids and drop them off. I mean, I don't know what went on in there. And, don't forget, in Nuremberg, they did away with one of the Nuremberg principles in 1950, adopted in international law, was that you cannot use the excuse of following an order anymore to justify a crime against humanity. Well, this is what they still do all the time. The United Church ministers who got rid of me would laugh about it. During my defrocking, they thought I was finished. They had taken away my family, my livelihood. They figured I was just going to crumple. And so they would joke with me. They felt they had nothing to lose. They said, of course we did these things, but who's ever going to care? This is Canada. Those are Indians. I mean, they would openly talk like that. So it kind of caused me to, reevaluate my sense of human morality, how flexible people are when it comes to ethics and human life. And it's kind of like that. We have infinite, it's like that picture of Adolf Hitler hugging little children, okay? Within our own circle of morality and life, we can love children all we like, but the others out there, it's almost, and I think Freud commented on this, Sigmund Freud in Civilization is Discontents. He said, we have infinite capacity to love those within our circle, as long as there's others on whom we can project our shadow, right? And that's very true in that we need those others to, and I serve that all the time. I've known that as a scapegoat when people go crazy and calling me names and everything. They're just venting their shadow because they can't look at their own guilt. They need to simply say it's a crazy minister who's making this stuff up. That way they don't have to look in the mirror and say, how could we, and this is the basic question, how could we as a culture have done this and allow it to carry on and now continue the crime by covering it up and allowing it to happen tomorrow? I mean, if we don't look at that, it's not about Native people. They're just the latest victims. It's about us and what happened to us back in Europe. And you know, our whole legacy of genocide, which spans millennia. And we've got to recover our humanity. And that's the only solution here, because we're just seeing the inhumanity play itself out again in this cover up in Kamloops, right?
So there's to and fro with the church then. The Canadian government is saying, hey, at least we paid out compensation. If the kids are dead, how is that helping anybody? Who's being compensated? Is that just PR?
It makes me so angry. This is blood money. And I'll tell you, the only people who talk about compensation are the bought off Native chiefs. In all of the healing circles and all the protests I've ever done over the decades about this, none of the survivors on the ground ever talk about getting money. They say, well, what good is that going to do to me, right? They give you enough just to kill yourself with. Like the settlement was $10,000 top, if you can prove it happened. And if you sign an indemnification where you say the churches didn't do anything wrong and I'll never sue them. If you're willing to debase yourself and accept blood money and sell out the dead that way, then yeah, you get a pat on the head and $10,000. Now shut up and go away. I mean, it's inhuman. It's as inhuman as the crime itself. And yet white Canadians look at that, and even a lot of Natives look at it, you know, in the official Native world, you know, the lawyers and the chief and counsel who have been brainwashed in the white system. And they say, well, that's fair. You know, they got some money out of it. I mean, it's like trying to read poetry to a Neanderthal. I mean, how do you even communicate that humanity to people who don't feel it? And so we never looked at this system, and this is the point. You never ask for anything out of really a satanic murderous system. You create that justice yourself. That's why we built these common law courts, making the citizen arrest. It's what forced this out in the open, that direct approach where we don't wait for the system, because it'll never respond except on its terms, which is to not, I have 3 words for it: kill, deny, repeat. You know, that's their system.
Do you have any survivors that would be willing to come on the show?
Yes. The fellow I spoke to yesterday, I don't want to say his name yet, but I will share it with you. He's a former policeman, a Native policeman. And he's been in hiding, like a lot of them have to do. But here's the problem. A lot of the people I worked with are dead now. A lot of the people in the Unrepentant documentary, they're either dead or scattered. We were targeted in a huge way. And you know, when I get targeted, I get some bad things said about me and I can't find a job and I'm on a blacklist. Okay. If I was Native, I'd be in a ditch 20 years ago. If you talk about this stuff, we've had 7 of our activists in Vancouver who are Native killed. The most blatant one being William Coombs, killed by arsenic poisoning, according to the nurse, Chloe Kirker, after he was about to, you know, report this stuff about Queen Elizabeth taking those kids from the Kamloops school. You know, I wouldn't be surprised if it was a Crown directive targeting the school for these digs to say, look, we've got to, you know, deal with these claims that are going to be coming out about the Queen taking kids. Let's whitewash Kamloops first, right? And the next one they're going to try is the mush hole where we dug, the other Anglican school in Brantford, Ontario, where these crimes are thoroughly documented. So in terms of survivors, I will do my best, but they're taking their life in their hands when they go public, right?
Really? Okay, we won't put them at risk.
Well, it's not. I don't want to speak for them. Well, all I can do is ask them if they're willing to and put you in touch with them. It's their decision, but they know what's at risk. They know it's they are risking their lives by talking about these things.
We can disguise people's faces and voices as well, if that would help the situation. Yeah. So how does this story unfold?
I hope they do come on, because you need to hear their voice.
Yeah, it will be very powerful. How does this story unfold now? Will more bodies be discovered? Will it continue to put pressure on the church to do an apology? Will the Pope come out and say something stronger? Or is everybody responsible just hoping it disappears out of the news?
Well, it doesn't matter what the Pope does. He's a convicted criminal. I don't really care what he says. He belongs in jail. You know, if the church was ever going to do anything right, they would release all the secret documents, which they probably destroyed by now, identify where the graves are, mortgage their church property, and surrender it back to the native people. You've got to restore what was taken. Surrender themselves for prosecution. We need a Nuremberg trial in Canada to deal with this stuff, not run by the government, obviously, but by international agencies, by the people themselves. That's what we've been trying to do since our ITCCS was formed in 2010. And so, yeah, what we'll see playing out is this will be used as the token, you know, look, we've looked in the ground. By definition, they can't look at any of the other sites because they've got to control it. They've got to control the information and the outcome. There won't be any evidence allowed to be released, which incriminates the church, which indicates serious crime like, you know, sterilization and that. The British Columbia coroner has said he's going to show up and do analysis of the remains. Well, the BC, that's a kiss of death because the BC coroner has a long history of covering up the deaths of Native people. They did it in the case of William Coombs, where nurse Chloe Kirker said he had all the lines on his fingernails of arsenic poisoning. He had none of the symptoms of TB. BC coroner says he died of tubercular meningitis. I mean, the cover-up is institutionalized, so you can't expect anything but things that serve them to be released publicly. That's why we need our own investigation. And, you know, I'm sure you've got the contact information for us, but murderbydecree.com is the essential thing for people to look at first.
So even Trudeau is calling on the church to release the documents and records of what happened at the schools. And he's intimated that he may use some government mechanism to force that. Is that just PR as well?
It's not just PR, it's incredible dissimulation because Trudeau himself allowed the churches to destroy documents. He and his predecessor, Stephen Harper, set up the TRC, which allowed the government, when they announced the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and both the Liberals and the Tories agreed to this, the churches had a 6-month period where they could glean through their own records and sift out. It's like saying to the serial killer, well, go through the stuff and let us know what you want us to look at. That's exactly what happened with TRC. The government's allowed document destruction for decades. Now suddenly Trudeau's pretending none of that history exists, and he's relying on people's absolute ignorance of their own history. He's committing another obstruction of justice. In a just world, he'd be in prison for what he's doing, right? Because he's just colluding in a cover-up, which under the law is as serious as the crime itself, right?
Okay, what would you like to say in conclusion about this story then, specifically to the people who are watching and are concerned about this discovery of the 215 corpses?
Do not believe what you see on the corporate mainstream. Go to sources like ours. We're one of the few independent inquiries going on. We're working with independent non-band council natives to bring up the truth. We also have promises of people we work with over the years in Europe and America to come as human rights observers to other sites that we're going to be going to. We're setting up our own forensic teams with ground penetrating radar archaeologists to come in and analyze the remains. We're reviving the Canadian Genocide Tribunal with our own investigators. And write to us. The best place to write to is itccsoffice@protonmail.com. That's the International Tribunal of Crimes of Church and State. itccsoffice@protonmail.com. Murderbydecree.com, and share that information you see. Our site, which I think you have, the bbsradio.com site, where we do our program every Sunday at 11 p.m. Greenwich time. That's where you can hear these eyewitnesses and others, the real information of what's coming out. Because if you allow them to get away with this, it's another nail in the coffin of these crimes that are ongoing, especially in the West Coast, where you're seeing more and more of these Native families disappearing. So it's really essential that we organize at the grassroots to counter these official lies and crimes.
Absolutely brilliant as usual. And in the email you sent me earlier, there was a lot of links. Does that include everything you just described, or do you need to send anything else over that we can put below the video?
I'll send you some more links, and I appreciate it, Sean. I appreciate all of this exposure. It can save lives, literally. So thank you. But the best place to find the updates is you also go to our Republic of Canada site, Republic of Kanata, Kanat, republicofkanata.ca, under breaking news. We have all of these, the YouTube links we're putting up every few days as we find out more evidence and that kind of stuff.
So if you were watching this, then all of the links that Kevin just described will be in the description box below the video, as will the playlist for the other videos we've done with Kevin. And like I said earlier, absolutely fascinating range of knowledge, not just about the atrocities in Canada, but, you know, wealth of knowledge about the church. And I've learned so much from him constantly. So I'm sure you guys will enjoy watching the videos and supporting his work. Huge thank you for coming on, Kevin. Really appreciate
Thank
that.
you, Sean.
And if anything
I
else,
just
break.
want to say in closing that I think my knowledge isn't simply book-based or research. It's from a whole life experience I've had, that destroyed my life. And people say, why do you do this? Well, it destroyed my life. It took my children from me. It's killed my friends. It's, violated my conscience. There's no way I can be part of the system after what I've endured. And so I think when people encounter this, like Native people, and they know it's a life and death issue, it's not like something they can turn away from. So I think that brings a richness into it, that it isn't simply a head thing for me. It's my life, and that's why I was put here. And so I want to appeal to people on that basis too.
Okay, brilliant. So on that note, thank you for watching. Let us know in the comments what you thought about this video, and please go down and support Kevin's work. So cheers from London. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean.